Kia ora koutou, ko Douglas Walker, toko ingoa. I'm here with Jared Fritchley, who's going to run us through the NCEA L3 AgHort, Analyse a New Zealand primary production environmental issue, and that's standard number 91532. Kia ora, Jared, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Welcome. Hopefully everyone's enthused about this. I know it's sort of a graveyard shift, Friday at 4:30, but obviously with the exam being on Monday, it's your last chance to do a bit of learning. So what I thought I'd do is I'd just as much as I can, talk through the stuff that I think is important to understand in terms of the standard, perhaps the exam, a bit of the content, but I'm making the assumption that you've all been in class and have listened to your teachers for perhaps 10 weeks talking about this, and it's perhaps just helping you out with a few things, perhaps exam technique or perhaps understanding some of the things you might need to walk in and be prepared with. So I'll just share my screen and we'll have a bit of a peek first at the standard. So again, I don't really like talking to a screen or a computer, but I'll do my best, and if there are any questions, then perhaps Doug will interject, or at the end we'll have a conversation around it. So here it is, 91532, or the 3.5 Analyse a New Zealand primary production environmental issue. This is the one that I probably find that I enjoy the best, and the boys tend to enjoy it as well. I think it's quite cool. There's a good mix here of some science. There's a good mix here of some of the social factors. There's a little bit of policy, politics, regulatory stuff, and also a bit about money. So it's quite a real one. And I always say to my lads, if they're able to interact with someone about the stuff we've learned within class, be it a farmer or perhaps someone in town about the issue, then they'll be able to do all right in the exam. But I won't just make any assumptions. I'll just whiz through a few things from the standards. That was the title we just read, Analyse a New Zealand primary production environmental issue. So analyse, you're examining, you're looking into trying to understand more about a New Zealand. So it has to be an example from a farm type or production system from within New Zealand, and about a primary production environmental issue. And if you're familiar with it, hopefully you've been told by your teacher that this year that's being signalled in the specs, and we'll get to those a little bit later on, is about greenhouse gases and sustainable production. And if you look at last year's, and we'll see that shortly, looking at the exam papers I've got open, these tabs above us here, there's been some questions around water quality or water or intensive production. So the important thing is, if you're a student and you go and look at perhaps the last couple of years' schedules, it's awesome to understand perhaps what the questions look like in past years, or the kind of evidence that students have walked in with, but being really, really clear that 2023 is about greenhouse gases from our primary production system, and not about water quality, not about other things from previous year's papers. And I might have seen one of my lads write about water quality after being told many, many times that he shouldn't. If we squiz down to the criteria, not a lot exciting here about the criteria, but if we do sort of see the difference, and we can unpack it down further. So if the student, if you guys want to get a pass, you've got to be able to analyse a New Zealand primary production environmental issue. The step up to merit is critically analysed, and the excellence is comprehensively analysed. And of course, that doesn't mean much until we get down to looking down here. So here is our achieve criteria, this part here. So these 3 bullet points tells us the kind of things we've got to be able to cover to be able to pass the standard. So the first part here is explaining the environmental issue arising from primary production management practices. So if we're looking this year at greenhouse gases as our environmental issue, then why is greenhouse gases an issue from your primary production system? Now, if you've chosen to look at dairy farming or sheep and beef farming, then you're probably going to be talking about the greenhouse gases that are emitted from perhaps the ruminant animals on your system, where if you were talking about some kind of a crop or fruit production, your greenhouse gas emissions might be coming from the machinery that you are using on your farm system. So it's really important we do understand that we are talking about an environmental issue from a particular system, and that'll become clearer when we look at the past papers as well. So hopefully, again, during the year, you've been learning about a particular system and the greenhouse gases and the issue that's been created from a specific system as opposed to generally from primary production. So the environmental issue. So for me, and from the standard, and we'll look at it down a bit further, it's not that when we talk about the environmental issue, we're talking here about where we're looking. Here is our impacts of our primary production system. So when we're talking about it, I'm looking with my guys about how when we're farming and we happen to look at sheep and beef this year as opposed to perhaps dairy last year, we're looking at what are the environmental implications from farming our animals. And obviously that is understanding what is the greenhouse gases, what is the greenhouse effect, what happens when we have greenhouse gases being emitted from primary production system, what are the specific greenhouse gases that are being emitted, perhaps what does it mean for the weather patterns that if we do have greenhouse gases emitted. So environmental impacts, I'm probably jumping around a little bit too much actually, is certainly a big part of it, and that's the real sciencey part, understanding the environmental issues that's being created. But at the same time, it's also important to realise that, and I said to my guys, when we're looking at dairy farming, the reason why we do have dairy farming for, even though it may be causing us some greenhouse gases to be emitted, it may be contributing towards our climate change or the greenhouse effect, that there's certainly massive economic gains from us farming animals. So that's our economic, or it's our money factor. So, farming gives us income, and if we were to probably look at it, and you could easily jump in your Uncle Google and have a looky, but we'll see there's a lot of money being made in the country from farming, and there isn't really a plan B or another option. We happen to produce lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, lots of meat, lots of milk. Obviously, we still produce wool, and those things all generate us income. So that's part of the understanding the bigger picture. Then there's the political as well. So when we are farming and we're releasing greenhouse gases or producing greenhouse gases, I look at it as in it's our regulatory, or it's our political, or it's our compliance aspect, and that's the government sort of putting some rules in place, or it's the government kind of directing or steering what we can and can't do on farm. And then there's the social impact, so the people factors. So if we don't have our dairy farming, or if we don't have primary production, that's a lot of people who aren't going to be employed. There's a lot of jobs that exist on the back of farming. If we don't have those farming systems, that's a lot of rural communities that break down. So I think it's quite a good topic that we learn about all of those different components when we're talking about primary production. We're trying to produce a product, and yes, it releases greenhouse gases, and yes, contributes towards our greenhouse gas profile as a country, but we're weighing up the environmental issues, the economic issues, the political issues, and the social issues, and it's a four-legged stool, and if one of those things isn't in check, then the stool falls over. So we can't have no greenhouse gases being produced without having impacts on the income as our country, or we're going to lose those jobs. If the rules are too strict, then again, we're going to have less income, but you might have a better environment. So it's quite good, I reckon, that we've got those four parts, and hopefully during the year you haven't just been focusing on the environmental issue from an environmental point of view. Yes, it's an environmental issue, but the implications are social, political, environmental, and what else did I say? Economic. But back to here. Sorry, I jumped around. So for a chief, you've covered those four bases around economic, environmental, social, and political issues that are being created, and that's part of the understanding where we are now. But then the next part is being able to go, like, where to from here, and says here we're going to be explaining potential courses of action to mitigate the negative impacts of the management practices. So what can we do to try and produce less greenhouse gases? What can we do to try and lessen our impact on the environment? And sometimes I know people get a bit fatigued about, we have to do more and more and more. But that's the reality with I think the changing world that we live in, that, the science changes, expectations change, Governments, now understanding that it's not just the rural group that is the political sway, but there's a lot of urban people. It's the market overseas. So we certainly are trying now to carry out some course of action to lessen the impact from our greenhouse gases being produced. And then lastly, you're recommending a course of action that's going to support sustainable management practices. So what is it you're going to do to try and lessen the amount of greenhouse gases produced so we can carry on farming? So we're not looking to farm and at the end of the year we stop. It's an infinite game. We want to keep doing it into the future. So we need to make some changes what we're doing to mitigate the negative impacts to be able to be sustainable, which is into the future. And all of that is for an achieved. So if you consider that, generally speaking, this is the first part of the exam. It might be if there's an exam part A, part B, part C. This is our part A and our part B. This part down here is our part C. So therefore, that's the what's next. This is where we are now. This is our what's next. And what I'm leading to is the fact that we can't just understand our issue currently. We can't just understand that greenhouse gases are being produced, that it's having some great economic sort of returns for the country. It's producing us lots of income. It's got jobs and prosperity in our regions, but not do what's next. We've got to do what's next. So essentially, if you're a candidate, you walk in, you smash out an awesome part A, you smash out an awesome part B, and then you walk away without doing part C, you haven't covered this part here. So in order to achieve the exam, you've got to answer all of the exam. And it's always been the case. 20 plus years, you couldn't just walk out early. There had to be this, what we're going to do into the future. The recommendations of the course of action has always been a part of it. So that's how achieved. If we move through to a merit, we're looking at these 3 bullet points here. So explaining in detail the environmental issue. So rather than generalizing around perhaps some of the greenhouse gases that are emitted, you understand how those greenhouse gases are emitted. And what's the system? If it's methane, how is it produced? What orifice does it leave from? How damaging a greenhouse gas it is? How much of our greenhouse gas profile is methane from our country? It might be, I'm losing my train of thought here. So, the more detail there, how big are greenhouse gases in New Zealand come from primary production versus other countries? So again, you've just got some more detail rather than generalization, superficial, skimming across the surface, having a basic understanding, but not much more. This has got our detail. So it's our evidence, it's our data there. Evaluating potential courses of action. This may include comparing and contrasting. So you're talking about perhaps strengths and weaknesses of the two. So maybe you've given 2 potential courses of action that producers can carry out, whether it's on your dairy farm, if that was your context, or whether it's on your orchard, if that was your context. And you've talked about, look, if I carry out this course of action, yes, it's going to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also going to mean I'm going to have less jobs on my property because I'm less productive. Versus this one here, it's going to have the same reduction in greenhouse gases, but I'm going to still have my same amount of full-time workers on my farm. So you're comparing and contrasting when you're evaluating potential course of action. And then, of course, you're recommending the course of action, which is going to best allow you to carry on into the future. So hopefully it's meeting more of those issues. Perhaps you've touched on, remember our 4 issues. We're talking about our environmental, our economic, our social, and our political. So you're touching on several of those. If you just talk about how your course of action is going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but you're not profitable and you're losing all your workers and the local school's going to close down, well, that's not sustainable. So we've touched on 3 or 4 of those 4 impacts or considerations that we saw just down here in the standard. And then our excellence criteria, justifying course of action to support sustainable production management practices that best address the issue. This includes environmental, economic, political, and or social considerations. So it's a really convincing course of action. So if we think about that, our part A in our exam is achieve merit. Our part B, if there is a part B, achieve merit. And our part C, or if it is only a 2-part exam, the last part, our course of action, is where the excellence part's being hung. And that's where, again, you've got a really, really clear, view of the future or a really, really compelling argument of the course of action that you can carry out in your production system, which is going to cover all of these 4 boxes. So reducing our greenhouse gases being produced. We're still allowing for economic prosperity. It's for our producer. It's for our local economy. It's for our country with our balance of trade. We're able to work within the rules. We're not sort of having to have more compliance put in place because we're not changing our behaviour. And, again, we've got heaps of jobs and vibrant communities, so we're not driving into the countryside and seeing shops boarded up and for lease signs in the windows. So that's our excellence answer. And again, it's the part C where we go from an achieve or a merit or our excellence. I'll just keep chucking through here in case you haven't had a look at this before. An environmental issue results from agricultural or horticultural primary production in New Zealand. Again, hopefully this year you've already covered with your teacher that you've learned about sheep and beef farming. You've learned about an apple production system and their greenhouse gases emitted. You have, so that's, you already know your primary production system and our environmental issue. Hopefully you've picked up by now that in 2023, it's on greenhouse gases. So that changes each year. So again, looking at past papers, great to give you an idea what it looks like or the schedule. But this year, 2023, we'll be learning about greenhouse gas emissions. Impacts of production management practices may be environmental, economic, political, and social, and we've covered that here about how we're going to try and allow for those. And earlier on, we talked about, when we talk about the issue that exists from our greenhouse gases is the fact that we've got these greenhouse gases, and that's obviously a negative thing. You could turn around and say it's a positive thing, more greenhouse gases, warmer climate, we can grow more plants, but it might also get drier, might also mean it's more insects or pests that don't get killed over winter. It might be that we have some more severe and significant weather impacts, and I'm not going to try and draw any correlations between some recent weather events and our greenhouse gases, but I mean, some of the science is suggesting that's the thing. So that's where we can talk about the negative or the positive. So our issue of greenhouse gases, generally speaking, for the environmental point of view, is negative. But if we're looking at it, the more animals we farm on our farm, the more intensive the more productive we are, perhaps the more income we get. So negative might be more greenhouse gases, but the positive might be that we've got more income, or the positive might be that social impact. We're down here, or the consideration where we've got more jobs. So the more animals we have, the more gases are released, but we have more workers or more people in our rural communities. So that was our impacts or our considerations. And again, I think if you were to talk with someone in the community about greenhouse gases and agriculture or horticulture, hopefully you're able to understand that's not just, like I keep repeating myself, not just the fact that greenhouse gases are being produced, but the greenhouse gases have been produced to produce a product, meat, milk, wool, fruit, vegetables to export. And by doing so, it generates us income, it gives us jobs and stuff. So that's why it's that we've got to weigh all those parts up together. Our course of action, again, that was our part we discussed as being our part C, or the last part of the exam, the part that you cannot walk out on and not fill in. That's our course of action. That's what we're going to do. So the words here are referred to responses carried out by the producer that may potentially mitigate the negative impacts of the production management practices. So that's our next step. So yep, we know we've got these greenhouse gases being produced from my orchard, but I'm going to get this massive new electric tractor. There's only 20 in the world, and it's not going to release greenhouse gases as the internal combustion engine would on a regular tractor. Or maybe there's some new spec tractor that's got less emissions from it functioning. For our animals, maybe we've got some animals that exist down the road somewhere. You've gone and seen a breeder, and they know that their animals have 15% less greenhouse gases than the average maybe sheep flock in New Zealand. So therefore, by using their genetics, we're going to be able to reduce or mitigate the negative impacts, trying to find ways to reduce the greenhouse gases. But it's really, really important. I probably do touch on this as well. The course of action is what the producer carries out. So this is the grower. So what can the producer, what can they do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We're not talking here about what the government can do or industry can do for you. What can the producer do at a farm level to mitigate the negative impacts, which is our greenhouse gases, which impact on, like I say, usually negatively the environment, and how we're going to reduce that. We talked about the fact that our excellence answer here, the course of actions, and to get this idea of sustainable production. That's where, get rid of that if I can. Sustainable production management practices refers to the management or parts of the environment. And for us this year, it's obviously our greenhouse gas, it's our air, to ensure continued use of these natural resources and primary production practices and to minimise negative impacts on the wider environment. So the continued use of, I talked before about being able to do it into the future, or being able to do it without an end point. So the continued use of is the same. So we don't want to be producing lots of something this year, but then next year we can't do it because we've degraded our environment or we've changed the environment and now we can't farm. So it's important that it's from a producer level, and able to do it into the future is really, really important. So that's the standard. I hope all of that stuff is familiar with us so far, that we're essentially analysing or examining a primary production environmental issue. This year, the environmental issue is greenhouse gas has been emitted, and we've hopefully been able to talk about the greenhouse gases being emitted impacts the environment, impacts us socially, environmentally, and politically. And then once we understand that big picture, then what's the next step? What are we going to do to try and mitigate those greenhouse gases, reduce the greenhouse gases to reduce the impact of those greenhouse gases? I thought I'd look at a couple of papers just to sort of so we can see the layout. I mean, I'm a big fan of we learn this stuff in class, but just to reduce the stress and to understand what you're walking into, looking at some past papers, although again, I'm going to make sure that it was really, really clear that last year's paper certainly had a very different question than this year in terms of it being about water and not about greenhouse gases. But, I think you'll see a similar front page. And again, so last year, we probably would find it in the specs, it probably said freshwater and sustainable production. So last year, that was their issue that they're looking at. This year, again, I'm going to keep repeating myself this whole way through until I stop talking, greenhouse gas is being produced. So they had a question at the start on environmental impacts. And again, we talked before, there's our 4 areas that our issue exists because of. So we've got greenhouse gases being produced, impacts socially, economically, environmentally, and politically. This question here, or part A, was looking at the environmental impacts. And again, I'm a big fan of the fact that I think that we have to understand that. I mean, we have to understand all parts of it. But I think if we didn't understand what the greenhouse gases that were produced in our system, and why we care about them for, how potent the greenhouse gases they are, why is it an issue for New Zealand that we have these greenhouse gases, then I think we've missed the crux of this. I think the employment and the income and the rules fall out of understanding it from an environmental sort of sense in the first place. So again, looking at the past paper, what is your primary product you're producing? So again, you're walking in your whole conversation, if you're a candidate for that hour, if you're spending an hour answering this paper, might be on your apple orchard you went and visited, might be on your dairy farm you went and visited, or if you didn't visit it, you learned about it, might be on your sheep and beef farm you went and visited. So we're looking at it from a primary product, and our whole way through, we're referring to our primary product or our primary production system or our farm that we're looking into, not just greenhouse gases from a generic sense, but from a specific primary production system or primary product. So explain the negative impact on fresh water. Again, this year's not us. This year's about our greenhouse gases. But do you understand why greenhouse gases would be bad, or what are the negative environmental issues from having greenhouse gases? And this is, I think, really important as well. And I don't want to shy away from this because I certainly push it with my boys. I don't think it's good enough to walk in and talk about something that you found from an article 10, 15 years ago. I've still got a pile of a booklet called Growing for Good, produced by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. I think it was in 2003 or 2004. Certainly a great resource to talk about or talk to all the boys to read about, but it's almost 20 years old, and there's more recent data, and there's clearer understanding now than there was back then. So this is where hopefully you're able to talk about perhaps the amount of jobs that exist or fall back on or are reliant on your farm system. So you could jump onto Dairy NZ and they'll tell you how many jobs on farm and then off farm exist because of dairy farming. So the fact that if we took away dairy farming or we had less production on dairy farms because we're trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas we produce, that's an impact on employment on those people. It's a social factor. And you could find figures around what that might have been in 2022. That's awesome. It's a year old. If you're pulling out figures of how many people were on farm from 2012 or 2004, then we're getting a bit old. So make sure whatever we can, we're using some more recent data. And there's plenty of really, really interesting things you can find out in your rural news paper, which I've got over there, or you can jump on and look through the internet. It's really easy to find recent data. Next part of this paper, the economic impacts or the economic considerations. So again, we've talked about the 4 that exist in the standard, and I'm going to keep repeating it: our environmental, our social, our economic, and our political. There's a couple there. So if we learnt about all 4 of those considerations or impacts, I think you've made sure that you've covered the bases. The idea of the exam isn't to, and there never has been any exams to assess all your knowledge. It assesses a selection of your knowledge. So there's certainly 2 of those 4 impacts or considerations that exist because of your primary production environmental issue, or it has negative or positive impacts on those things. And then we just fall out to the last part, which is our part C, which again is our courses of action, or what's the next step, what can we do? And again, if we don't answer this, that's where we can't pass the standard, because our first part, our part A and our part C, this paper here was covering what our current picture looks like, and our part C is what can our producer do on farm, on orchard, in order to reduce or mitigate those negative impacts. So how can we not lose those jobs? How can we keep on producing our product so we can export it and make money again from a farm point of view, from our local community point of view, from the wider country as an exporting nation point of view? And being able to talk about a couple of things they can do. So there's always, growers have always got options. I can carry out one of these 1, 2, 3, 4 things. In reality, they might actually carry out 2 or 3 of those things, but what are the pros and cons for each of those courses of action that they're producing and carry out? So again, I think looking at past papers gives you an idea of the kind of things that have been assessed. Lots of lines there. I'm a big fan of when I mark my kids' student scripts at school. I go through and I tick on their script from their essays when I like something. So when I've said something of meaning or something relevant, and I get students, and like the whole page looks just littered with red ticks, and I've said lots of ideas that are mark worthy because they answer the question. And then there's some that'll write a whole page and get 2 ticks because a lot of it is just having a bit of a chat and not actually answering the question or say something meaningful, which is also why this little planning part exists here. So if you want to, and you've walked in and you've got your pens and pencils in your little clear bag and you've got your calculator maybe, and they say you can start writing, there's a chance there to write down all those little stats, all those little numbers that you had, or maybe you want to prepare a little bit of an order or a flow diagram of how you want to structure your response. So more of the things that you write as mark worthy. So that's the 2022 paper. Like I said, that was on water quality. This year it's not. 2021 script, again, well, it looked similar. I reckon it would. How come? Well, it's assessing the same standard. The only difference is that the environmental issue for this year is different to the previous year and the previous year. although a little bit naughty because there's actually 2 years in a row on fresh water. I think slightly different wording. One was on fresh water and sustainability, but again around fresh water. But let's look at how it looks though. Yep, planning page is still there. And yep, looking at the environmental impacts. So again, environmental, social, economic, and political as our 4 considerations, or the impacts that our primary production system, primary product that we're producing can have on those 4 things, positive or negative. And again, environmental is pretty significant. If we didn't understand, I'll repeat myself again, the greenhouse gases and the understanding why we care about those greenhouse gases, I think you've missed a really, really important part of the standard. So our 2022 paper, it was about, I think, economic impact. Here we've got social impact. So just changes from year to year just to make sure that we students are learning about all of those 4 considerations or impacts from producing your primary product. And still a part C with the course of action, recommend a course of action that producers can carry out to further reduce their negative impacts. And we've got one more script before we move away from past papers. Here's our 2020 paper. Again, having to talk about, as we all write, you're learning about your apple orchard, or you went and visited a kiwi fruit grower. Maybe if it's curious, you learn about her artichokes. Maybe it's sheep and beef farm. Maybe it's a dairy farm. But we're talking about a specific production system farm that you're operating on. So your conversation is about that farm, not just the water quality, not just greenhouse gases in a general sense. And again, this year there was a different context to ours. For this year, theirs was around intensive production and environmental sustainability. So again, different to ours this year. Always interesting when we've got a bit of text, and you'll see that on the last 3 papers we looked at. The idea of the text isn't for you guys to sort of go through a comprehension exercise of reading that and pulling data out of it. You would have, again, sat in class for 10 weeks learning about this topic, and hopefully you've got some of your own figures around how much on your sheep and beef farm of our greenhouse gases are nitrous oxide, how much of our greenhouse gases are methane, how much of our greenhouse gases are CO2. Why do we care so much about that methane compared to perhaps CO2? Those are the conversations, the things that you've learned about in class, not just pulling it from this. This is more perhaps as a thing to remind you of the topic that you've been learning about. Sometimes they call it stimulus material, but certainly don't go looking for this to give you your answers. You've been learning that for a while, and you've still got tonight and the weekend to prepare some data to support your answers. Looking at those past 3 years' papers, you can see it's a pretty similar script, so you can be pretty confident that you can prepare the evidence that's required for that paper. And again, hopefully you learn about it. This is just making sure that your mind's organised. But if I did whip through here, what is it the growers are doing? So if you look at that from a point of view of perhaps my guys of a sheep and beef farm, the fact that they have these animals out on their farm grazing to put on weight, they're eating food, they're breaking down the different feed types, and it's releasing some greenhouse gases. If it is that we're putting on some fertilizer in order to grow more grasses, then that's going to be releasing some greenhouse gases. So we can talk about, if we're required to, what our farm looks like. If it's a orchard or it's a vineyard, then again, are we talking mainly around the combustion of fossil fuels? Are we talking about fertilizer as well as things that we do on that system in order to produce our product, and what other greenhouse gases being produced? And I reckon you wouldn't be surprised. Look, here we go. Some environmental, some social, some economic impacts / considerations from producing a primary product. And I reckon you can probably guess as well that the last part down here is going to be, what are some realistic courses of action that our producer could carry out? So again, and knowing where we're currently at, what we can do to mitigate our negative impacts on the environment while still maintaining profitability, while still maintaining employment for our little local region. So some pretty similar things from year to year. If we look at the assessment report, it's always useful. So whoever the poor buggers are, that mark this, write these things down. So I will read it through, even though I know you can read for yourself, because I might be able to read through and then highlight a few things. So candidates generally selected primary products that allow them to answer all parts of the examination. So again, if you're going to choose artichokes to answer this exam for 91532, you're probably going to find it'll be difficult, because there probably isn't much data or resource available talking about the greenhouse gases produced from growing artichokes. Where if we did look at sheep and beef, we looked at dairy, we looked at deer, even kiwi fruit, there is quite a lot of data that's been collected, research that's been done, paid for. So therefore, it's easy to find supporting evidence if you choose a primary product that's more significant, so you can find some resources. I wouldn't go looking at watercress as a product and talk about the greenhouse gases produced from getting watercress either. Again, stick to the major products or the production systems, because there's easily available data for those. The availability of primary product supporting data for this course allowed candidates to gain high levels of achievement. So the more access to the data, the evidence, the higher the level of the achievement that can be gained by the candidate in the exam. Candidates who had completed field trips to primary producers often referred to this knowledge gained in their responses and got to high levels of achievement. So again, sometimes the growers have got insights. They're usually pretty savvy at knowing what they do and why. So again, field trips are pretty important. Although this is a general commentary for the three of the externals, probably if you're honest about it, growers wouldn't be the best person to tell you about their greenhouse gas emissions profile or about how potent different greenhouse gases are, but they're certainly aware of some of the rules and regulations that are coming in. So not super important for this particular standard, but if you have gone to a field trip, I'm sure you have got some intel that the grower is able to share with you. Candidates must read the question carefully to ensure they're writing responses that answer the question. I often have boys writing some really, really interesting things in their exams that's absolutely correct and factually, supported with some good evidence. But if it doesn't answer the question, they don't get those red ticks in class. So just taking the time. I think one really, really good thing you can do when you're answering exam papers is getting into the room, not telling you any exam technique. It's not my expertise, but I'd be saying to my kid, if he listens to me, to sit down, open his little bag up, get his 3 booklets or 2 booklets or 1 booklet out, and the first thing you do is just read it from cover to cover, to making sure you've read all of the question, part A, part B, part C in the case of our exam, and making sure you understand what's required, and then going through and just orderly, reading a question, writing the answer, back to the question, am I answering it, back to the question, is there 1 or 2 or 3 parts to this question, and making sure you're answering the question. So sorry to be a bit sort of simple, but answering the question is really, really important. Candidates use highlighters to highlight the question, the key parts of it, underline it. You can draw all over the exam paper if you want to with your planning for yourself, but making sure you understand what you're trying to answer is really important. Some candidates spend too much time rewriting their questions or writing superfluous information. Again, just making sure that you write the answer. You're not trying to sort of lead the market down a garden path by rewriting the question because you're not sure what the answer is. It just wastes lines. Candidates who gain high levels of achievement generally wrote more accurate responses. So you got to the point, you said the facts, answered the question, and lots of really, really good evidence. Candidates who have current knowledge of primary products in relation to the assessments were able to attain high levels of achievement. So the current knowledge. So again, I think if you're a candidate and you can sit down tonight with mum and dad at the dinner table and you could talk to them around greenhouse gases that are produced from the production of your, again, apples, your kiwi fruit, your sheep and beef, your dairy, and you know the different greenhouse gases produced, how much of the different greenhouse gases are produced, why we care that you're producing greenhouses, but at the same time, knowing how much jobs, economic prosperity exists because we're producing a primary product, and also perhaps the response from the regulatory bodies, the government, putting some rules in place. And again, that's probably the stuff that I see the most in the rural newspapers is around different, global acts that have been signed, or what the government's going to do with its waka iki noa, or its, greenhouse gas emissions sort of taxes that eventually will come in. And there's obviously different political parties that have different ideas around when they'll start taxing. Those are all really, really cool things. And if you have that current knowledge, and you can have those conversations with your parents at the dinner table, I think you've got the evidence to be able to write it down and examine it as well. And then the next part, of course, is being able to tell your parents, what it is that the growers can do to reduce their emissions. And there's always things we can do. There's things that I can do to improve my teaching practice, and hopefully I have been improving. Hopefully I'll keep improving, and farmers are the same, finding ways to still be as productive, but trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Or are we able to reduce our emissions and have a small reduction in productivity, perhaps be able to sell it for more in market because it's got a really, really cool story, or the customer's demanding it. So I think the current knowledge is really important as well. And again, that comes back to not going back to 2004, the Growing for Good from the PCE. It's a great book, but it's not current knowledge. And again, the magazines, the conversations from the ministers, you jumping on and looking at Dairy NZ, there's some really, really good evidence out there as well. If we just buzz through to the standard-specific stuff, and hopefully I haven't lost you, haven't fallen asleep, you've done well so far. Examination. This examination had one question with parts A, part B, part C. So one question means that there's going to be on the front of your booklet at the end of it a 0, or it could be a blank paper, but otherwise it'll be a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One question item only, which means one question only, which means just that one excellence response. And if you could find a paper back to, I think I'm right here, 2002, it's always been a one question paper, because it's just been this one excellence, which is justify the most significant course of action. So it's always been a one question paper. And again, if you answer part A and not part B and C, you can't pass. If you answer part A and part B and not part C, you can't pass. So making sure that you've got a response for all of those three parts for this paper is important. Otherwise, you won't be able to pass the standard, because, or this exam and the standard, because you haven't talked about what are some courses of action, which we saw in the criteria was important to be able to do. Candidates were required to show understanding of the environmental impacts on freshwater. Again, this is last year. This year is going to be, do you understand the greenhouse gas that have been produced? Could it be what is our profile? How damaging greenhouse gases are they? Where do the gases come from? From animals, which end does it fall out of? Or if it's your cropping, or again, your orchard or your vineyard, how are the greenhouse gases being produced? They're also required to understand the economic outcomes from producing a primary product. And again, producers, businesses, and they produce a primary product in order to produce money. It's great for them as a producer. It means they can pay their mortgage. It means they can afford to put their kids to school somewhere. For the local community, it means that there's money being spent in the businesses, the shops in the town. It also means as a country we're able to export our primary products, which is how we get most of our earnings. Otherwise, I think it was Keith Woodford said there is no plan B when it comes to exports. Primary production is it for us. And at the same time, also making sure we've got that social, the jobs. I mean, it would be great if we had pristine water here in the Hawke's Bay, and we could do it in our rivers, but it means we'll have no intensive production systems. So all the apple trees are gone, maybe some of the sheep and beef farms are gone, kiwi fruit producers are gone. So it's again balancing up those four parts. So we want to be able to produce a primary product, but we also want to have employment. We also want to have exports. Those things are all important, and again, working within the regulatory rules as well. Finally, the candidates were required to show what the primary producer was doing next to reduce negative impacts on freshwater. Again, for us this year, it's making sure that you're able to say how the primary producer is able to reduce their negative impacts, i.e. reduce their greenhouse gases being produced. But if you just say, look, let's go and buy an electric tractor, and it's going to reduce your greenhouse gases being emitted, sure. You may have touched on the environmental part of the answer, but have you talked about the productivity in terms of how much money you can make? Well, if that tractor's going to cost you, 3 times the price of internal combustion engine, then you haven't really touched on the economic consideration or the impact. Have you talked about, is it going to impact on your employment, your workers on your farm? Does it allow you to work within the rules or the constraints or the regulations? So making sure you've covered all 4 parts, because I could talk about a farmer that's going to produce less greenhouse gases because he offloads 20% of his stock, but that means he's going to have probably, and I'm not an expert in it, and I certainly don't own a farm, but it means he's going to be less productive and therefore probably going to have less workers on the farm. It's going to produce less money. It might not be profitable, and therefore you might be having a conversation with the bank manager, but you might be satisfying the government by working within their rules or paying their taxes. So again, those 4 considerations are always part of our thoughts early on, where we're at currently, but our course of action needs to consider those as we work through the script as well. I won't go through our achieve, our not achieve, and our merit and excellence, or should I? Yeah, well, pretty quickly. So not achieve, obviously it's not our aim, did not explain the environmental issue, and more commonly did not give economic benefits of producing primary product. Oliver. That's my kid. So did not explain the environmental issue. So therefore, obviously, if you didn't get not achieved, if you got not achieved, it means you wouldn't have explained the greenhouse gases that have been produced or why we care that greenhouse gases have been produced. Their course of action is insufficient detail. So you haven't convinced the market that you understand how you are able to reduce your greenhouse gases. So this student really deserve not to pass. They didn't really understand why greenhouse gases are an issue, and they haven't really said how they're going to be able to reduce their greenhouse gases from producing their product. An achieved candidate understood the issue. They understand why greenhouse gases are a concern, and go, yep, we understand that there's an issue to confront, and we can understand how we're able to reduce our greenhouse gases in some way, and probably just talking about reducing the gases, but I haven't probably touched on the other parts of our considerations, which is our people factor, our economic factor, or our political factor. Our merit candidate, they've got some correct details or figures. So they're not just rattling out some greenhouse gases. They know that perhaps the biological way that the greenhouse gases were produced, or they know how the greenhouse gases perhaps cycle in nature. They've got some figures. This is our science part of the standard, and you've got some facts and figures there. Our economic benefit, so the less sciencey now, if it was economic or if it was social, political, now we're talking about regulation, or now we're talking about people factors, not as scientific, but we need to have figures to back it up. So how much employment, how much money is produced or exported from producing your primary product. And then, explaining how the course of action will help prevent the environmental issue, but also understanding not just that environmental issue, but again, they've touched on some social or some economic benefits. So again, they've realised a little wider than simply producing less gases. They're producing less gases, but they're also mindful of the impacts on the jobs, on the income for the individual, the region, the country. The excellence one, again, correct details and figures of the environmental issue. Again, we've got some correct figures again of the economic benefit for us, political, social, economic stuff there, and discussed a course of action to help prevent the environmental issue for us this year, greenhouse gases that's produced. But at the same time, we've been able to discuss how we're able to make some improvements or some gains in reducing our greenhouse gases, but we've also been able to still be productive. We're still actually making money. We're not having a conversation with the bank manager. We're still profitable, and we're still being able to have those jobs. So it's sustainable moving forward, not just from an environmental sense, but also from a social sense, our people, and also an economic sense, which is our profitability. And that's really important. And that's, it's not easy, but that's what it's excellence criteria for. That you've got a really, really thought out answer, and you understand, again, we've talked about that four-legged stool. It's not just about solving the environmental issue. If we've got no profitable business and we're laying off all our staff, and we've got our local school closing down, and we've got 4 lease signs in all the shop windows everywhere, that's not ideal. If I stop sharing, I'll be able to then duck across to a different screen. No, I'll just there. Give me a sec. Stop sharing, and then we'll go to Safari. All right, I'll go here. Oh, one more. It was the specs. I keep hitting the same one, don't I? I'll go to my Schoology page. So here's my little Schoology page where I've got a few little things you can look at. If it was you that wanted to, obviously you can pause on the video, you can see what it looks like, and you can go find it yourself. But here's a couple of things that I looked at with my lads, just to get an idea of what could be discussions. This is Professor Sir Peter Gluckman. He talks here about mitigating agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So, how can New Zealand mitigate, which is the wording that we've been talking about, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And you can read widely, and there's certainly no silver bullet, one little resource that's nice and succinct, but there's some really, really good learning by doing some reading, and you can pull little gems out as you go through. So Peter Gluckman, again, talks here about, the issue that New Zealand has, being very reliant on primary production, lots of greenhouse gases produced from it, but still having to find a way to reduce our emissions because this is the reality of the world that we live in. So that's a really, really good article to look at or look into. So mitigating agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, strategies for meeting New Zealand's goals 2018. So we're talking that little 5-year period, remember. That's not a bad one to look at. And then what else we got? Paris Agreement. It's always interesting to look at this. Maybe it doesn't take us to it. There we go. But there's a global agreement that countries kind of looked into. Go, look, are we believing in this climate change thing? Are we believing in this greenhouse gas thing, and making some kind of ambitious targets of what we could do? Each country then goes back and ratifies and puts its own policies in place. But certainly, it was a catalyst to have a conversation around greenhouse gases and emissions. Motu, little research group, I think from Palmerston North. Cow, Sheep and Science, a scientific perspective on biological emissions for agriculture. As you can see, my ones I was looking at with my lads was around animals and stock. But if you were looking at an orchard, whether it's kiwi fruit, apples, grapes, or whatever else you're looking around the country, you'd have different articles. But again, just a great chance to do some reading. Although here we're looking at, was that 7 years? So starting to get a little bit sort of old if I'm going to start quoting figures from it, but it can still give you a context around the research, how easy it is to find ways to reduce our greenhouse gases. So another little great article. And I hope that you've already been looking at things like this. I don't tend to try and give my students an answer to regurgitate in the exam. Again, I want them to be able to go out in the community or come home at night and talk with their parents around our greenhouse gases, the impacts, again, environmental, political, social, economic, and then, next step. We're not saying, like, we can say that we're the lowest emitting country of greenhouse gases if you want, but then maybe we are at the farm gate for some farms, and you look then at the processing, and then there's the transportation. Are we still the best? Maybe in some cases we are the most efficient producer. Are other countries doing some useful things to reduce their emissions? And if we're not careful, maybe they start passing us with their emission profiles from their primary products. Again, I think there's an article before in the Berg group. If not, maybe this was it. A report of the Biological Emissions Reference Group. Great little report. These are the groups that were involved in it. So again, Beef and Lamb, Dairy NZ, who individually on their own websites have some pretty interesting or useful data. So those guys there were looking at, again, what are the greenhouse gases, impacts of the greenhouse gases on the environment in ways we can reduce our emissions. So again, there's plenty of good stuff if you wanted to have a bit of a peek. So again, you'd search for the Berg report. I'll do a couple more in case you're still awake. New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. I think it's a website you can go to have a look, and future options to reduce biological greenhouse gases. So there are options that producers can carry out on farm to reduce their emissions. We're not talking here about some of the stuff that's going to be in the pipeline that might come online in 5 years' time, but the things that we can already do to reduce our emissions. It might be if you've been in class and you are looking at livestock production, whether it's sheep, beef, dairy, whatever it may be, maybe you already are talking about different feed types that have different amount of emissions once it goes through the rumination process in the animal. Maybe we're looking at different additives you can put onto your feed or within the diet, or supplements that maybe change the processes in the rumen and release less greenhouse gases. Maybe looking at breeding as a way to reduce your greenhouse gases. These are the things here these guys touch on, but again, you probably already discussed it in class as well. I'll jump down. This is interesting, at least I think it was. It's a website, I think it's called Our World in Data. And it's really quite cool when you can whip through and you can see different countries' amounts of greenhouse gases per capita, different amounts of greenhouse gases from your CO2, your methane, your nitrous. So I forget how to use it because a while ago I was looking at it. But you can certainly have one of the gases, have three of the gases on a little graph, and what the trend's been, where it's been increasing, decreasing. You can compare New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. You can plug in Australia. You can plug in other countries, make comparisons, or you can just look at it. And I hope this isn't new to you, but New Zealand has quite a large profile of greenhouse gases from primary production. You jump onto the China as a country in here, and all of a sudden, agricultural primary production is very, very low down. I think it's transportation, electricity, heating are their big emitters of greenhouse gases. So they're not producing lots of greenhouse gas in primary production, but of course, a little more complex, but they do import our primary production. So therefore, there are some greenhouse gases that are produced in our country that they obviously consume as food products. But really interesting to make some comparisons between countries using Our World in Data as a website. Dairy NZ, again, like I say, this is from their website. So Dairy NZ have some really useful things for farmers, understand their emissions profiles, understand what they can do. Again, nothing is going to be a silver bullet that you can just take and do it or for an exam, but really, really useful to look at. So again, this one here is called On-Farm Emissions. I must have just found it from their website, and it again talks about New Zealand's dairy carbon footprint. So we know what because remember, we're interested to hear about New Zealand, not other countries. We're interested about our primary production system or primary product within New Zealand. So if you have chosen dairy farming, Dairy NZ has some good data there as well. So again, just a chance to read through really interesting stuff, some good science again when it comes to the environmental impacts or considerations. We get a bit social when it comes to obviously our people factor, employments, our rural economies, whether they're vibrant or whether they're struggling. We've got some good economic data, which keeps our sort of social science faculty excited when it comes to us talking about economics of stuff. And then obviously, like I said, political when it comes to regulation. So there's a really, really cool data there as well. I did see one other thing which I should have shared. I get a bit, I don't know, I just do some random stuff sometimes. And so I think necessity, there's some other invention. I think the fact that I don't think farmers necessarily do things always kind of by themselves. Sometimes we have to get encouraged to do things. And I think the reduction of greenhouse gases is one of those things, and whether that sort of the need make some change on greenhouse gases. Some obvious people or farmers, producers would do it themselves on their own back. Maybe some are going to do it because the regulatory kind of rules put in place by our government might mean that their hand is forced. Some of them might chase the market, and people might be willing to pay premiums for products that have got a good story. And my wife certainly buys milk and Bostock chickens and free range eggs and stuff because it's got a nice little story to it. So maybe that's a motivating factor for some people. So I think sometimes we've got to look at what the motivation or the reason is for people changing there, and that for us it's reducing greenhouse gases for 2023. So there's a couple more again. The Motu we saw before, the PCE. So I've always liked the PCE. I know I said I wouldn't keep going, but I'll stop here. But the PCE is the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment. And they write this one's 2016, so we're getting to sort of 7 years' time. But the PCEs are really interesting documents to read because it's produced not by a group, in my view, with vested interests. So when you look at it, it's science, it's evidence-based without sort of cherry-picking the data. So the Parliamentary Commissioner's reports are often quite useful. Here we go, I'm just scrolling through, I'm talking. These are greenhouse gas profile, how methane is produced, how nitrous is produced, total emissions from our primary production and its intensity. Changing farm management can reduce emissions. So, I mean, most of the articles you would have seen in my little Schoology page there basically covers this material that's required for the exam. So again, repeat myself, but if you can hold a conversation with someone, evidence-backed, you can justify the greenhouse gases, you can say the importance of primary production to the country, how much money it's going to earn us, farmer, local community, the whole country, how many jobs rely on it. I think you're in a good position to do well in the examination. So that's kind of my thoughts around the exam. I'm not going to give you specific things to write down because the cool thing about this topic or the standard is that you're able to talk about your own primary product. So again, if you have been talking about or you have visited a sheep and beef farm or an apple orchard, you've learned about the greenhouse gases, you've learned about hopefully the income, the employment, the rules that the farmer is going to have to navigate at some point moving forward. And if they have told you or you've learned about it from your research online, you understand ways that the primary producer is able to reduce the greenhouse gases. And if I can just find the specs, that's not. But if I just start closing stuff, that one's gone now. Close all tabs for that one. Where are we? It's not that one. Here we go. All right. So this is the last thing I'll share. So this is our specs. So in case you didn't believe me, I was making it up about what this year's exam is about. Here is our assessment specifications. These exist for all of your subjects.
We're not seeing that. We've got a little bar, as far as I can tell, that's like a URL bar or similar, but we don't have the main screen.
Oh, all right. I'll go out of there. I'll try it again, shall I? One more try, because I've tried a few times. It hasn't quite liked it, has it?
No, it hasn't.
So you can't see that there?
No, it's given us like it's just like we can see the tabs, but we can't see the page. If that makes sense.
All right, cool. All right, I'll just read it out. But it's not important. But in terms of you seeing it, maybe. So every subject, every level has assessment specifications. And that's where the examiner is going to share any specifics that's required for an exam, because it varies from maybe the norm or the specific focus. And I'll read the little blurb at the bottom. The environmental issue will focus on New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions from producing primary products. So this year, 2023, producing our greenhouse gas emissions from producing primary products. Our candidates should have an understanding of the environmental, economic, social, and political considerations that support sustainable production. Recent data and evidence within the past 5 years is preferable. So if you've been learning about greenhouse gas productions and you've covered the environmental, economic, political and social, and you've got some course of action moving forward, then you're in a good space. Like I say, the cool thing about this exam is it does give you the space as a teacher, wherever you are in the country, to go and do your own visit or look at your own systems, which is why I haven't walked through this is the answer, because everyone in the country has probably walked in with something else. So I don't know, Doug, is that probably right? Is there any questions that have popped up, or maybe the questions will come later on?
Yeah, I've got a couple for you. Hey, thank you so much for that, Jared. How important is it to state sources of data? You've talked about stats. Do students have to say where those have come from?
Yeah, good question. Like, I don't think you get super worried, but I guess my thing I say to my fellas in my classes is if I was marking the exam or marking theirs, I often have boys saying different things. So if I just see some random stats, I don't want to swear on the computer, but I kind of call bullshit on the kids. Where if a student said, look, Dairy NZ website states that 48% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from primary production, that's awesome. You've said that Dairy NZ website said that. If you said that, the Berg report says that and a number, I think that's really good, because it helps them to probably see the evidence. I'm not going to say you've got to have some amazing formatting system for it, but I do think that saying where it came from is good. If you've been for a visit and you've got a farmer that you visited, saying the farmer's name, although it might seem trivial and it might seem that you're making it up, otherwise, where's it come from? So I do think some form of saying where it came from, just so the person who's marking your script has an idea, I think is useful. And I certainly encourage my boys to do it. But like I say, there certainly isn't the same that's required for an internal, where you might have an ABA formatting for your referencing, which is your minimum. Certainly not for the exam.
Cool, thank you. How much of the science of how greenhouse gases absorb infrared radiation is needed?
Yeah, so again, I reckon that, I know this is agricultural and horticultural science, but you can't tell me that there's lots of social science and kind of political considerations as well. So I reckon it's important, and again, I'm not an expert, and I'm only doing this for the year like other teachers are, but I certainly believe that knowing our greenhouse gas profile as a country and how it compares to other countries kind of lets people know why we're taking it really seriously. Like if we were China and most of our emissions comes from transport and electricity, then you'd probably be focusing on that. The fact that we're focusing on agriculture is because it's a big part of our emissions. Understanding the three different gases and their potency, and therefore, like you kind of alluded to that question, how much they actually can trap or heat up the atmosphere is important. But I don't think you need to go too far with it. That's my thinking. I think you need to understand, if you talk to a farmer, if he understands that, and he does understand that, the more stuff that animals are eating means he's going to produce more greenhouse gases, because my understanding is that the amount of greenhouse gases produced is directly related to the food consumption, the quantity of food consumed. So therefore, an animal that eats higher quality food can eat less of it, and therefore the gases produced would be less. So I think it's more important to be able to kind of being able to talk about it, not in a farming kind of a language or colloquial kind of a conversation, but I do think you've got to be able to go, how far do I go? And if you're saying to the farmer, look, we need to focus on the methane emissions because it's this much more damaging than CO2, I think that's the kind of the distance we get to, because you've got to make sure you can do the same kind of detail with our social and our economic considerations, not have an awesome scientific conversation around the gases, but then not know why we farm for, in terms of the economic importance to the farmer, the local economy, and national the country, and how many jobs exist. So I think if you look at it in balance, I think you realise how far to go, and I think the potency compared to each other and why the focus is on some gases more than others, and short-lived versus long-lived kind of gases is, I think, enough.
Yep. Lovely, thank you.
Yeah.
Your Schoology looked really good. Could you share a link, and I'll put it in the description?
Yep. I'll try and do that. Maybe after this you can have a chat and tell me how to chuck some stuff up onto there. But again, the cool thing was that not all those things are available, and it's just if you read through, there's some similar themes as you go through each of them. But I just find them it's really, really interesting learning, and hopefully during the year, students who have been learning about this topic see the relevance of it. So much of the stuff that we read in the local newspapers and farming newspapers is about greenhouse gases, and obviously there's contention around the greenhouse gases in terms of how damaging they are and how far we go as a country. And there's some great conversations about different political parties putting in taxes in 2025 or 2030, and other political parties saying let's align our taxes with I think it's our 5 biggest trading partners to make sure that we're not going too far with our greenhouse gas rules and regulations, but also not doing enough. So sorry, that wasn't a real answer question, but yes, we'll figure out how to share that for sure.
Lovely. Hey, thank you so much, Jared. You talked about improving your own teaching, and I think I'll add the thanks of everybody who's watched this already, or is watching it, or will watch it ahead of the exam. Really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise, and thank you on behalf of all of us who will be doing that exam next week.
Awesome. Cool.
Lovely.
Go well. Good luck. And be prepared, because you can't wing it. So make sure you have done some reading and you've got a few little gems that you can share.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jared.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Cheers.